Sophie's Choice Film Summary: The Anatomy of an Impossible Decision. Sophie's Choice, 1982. Film Summary: A love triangle haunted by an impossible demand. Sophie's Choice, directed by Alan J. Pakula, 1982, is a psychological drama that starts like a post-war coming-of-age story and becomes a slow revelation about how trauma reshapes love, memory, and identity. This film summary is built for listeners who want the full emotional logic of the story, not just the headline of the title. At first, the movie feels almost warm. A young writer arrives in Brooklyn, makes friends, chases a dream, and gets pulled into the orbit of two magnetic, damaged people. Then the film tightens. It asks what happens when charm is mixed with violence, when romance becomes a sedative, and when survival itself becomes a source of lifelong shame. The main conflict is both what happened to Sophie in the war and why the present can't last. A relationship that looks like passion begins to resemble a cage, and a friendship that feels like rescue begins to look like illusion. The story turns on whether Sophie can escape the past without destroying the present. Full plot. Spoilers start here. Act 1. Setup and inciting incident. Stingo, a young writer who wants to begin his first serious novel, arrives in Brooklyn in 1947, trying to reinvent himself. He is new to the neighborhood, full of ambition, and lonely enough to attach quickly to people who feel vivid. He rents a room in a boarding house in a Jewish area and starts observing the city with the hungry attention of someone trying to turn life into pages. Stingo meets Sophie Zawistarska, a Polish immigrant who wants stability and relief from her own memories, and Nathan Landau, Sophie's lover who wants control, admiration, and the high of his own intensity. They are a striking couple, glamorous, playful, and theatrical in public, but strangely tense in the quiet moments. Stingo is drawn to them the way a moth is drawn to a bright, beautiful flame. Sophie welcomes Stingo. She is friendly, flirtatious, and oddly quick to confess small vulnerabilities. Nathan charms Stingo with intelligence and big talk, offering the kind of dazzling certainty that makes a young man feel chosen. Nathan tells stories about his work and his interests. He speaks with the authority of someone who expects to be believed. Very soon, cracks show. Nathan suddenly exhibits mood swings. He becomes jealous and suspicious, then affectionate and apologetic. When Nathan is angry, Sophie becomes smaller. She tries to placate him, soothe him, and predict him. Stingo watches the cycle and feels the first tug of responsibility. He wants to help, but he does not yet understand the depth of what he is stepping into. The inciting incident is not a single explosion. It is Stingo's decision to move from observer to participant. He accepts the couple's attention, spends time with them, and begins to feel like he has a role in their lives. That role becomes dangerous because it places him inside a relationship that runs on volatility. What changes here is that Stingo stops being a stranger in Brooklyn and becomes emotionally invested in saving a life he barely understands. Act 2. Escalation and midpoint shift. As their friendship intensifies, Stingo begins to perceive a fear-infused love between Sophie and Nathan. Nathan's jealousy is constant. When he believes Sophie has been unfaithful, he harasses her. When he calms down, he overwhelms her with charm, gifts, and affection. The cycle teaches Sophie to measure safety by Nathan's mood instead of her needs. Stingo tries to create moments where Sophie can breathe. He listens. He takes her seriously. He becomes a witness, and in trauma stories, a witness can feel like a lifeline. Sophie begins to share pieces of her past. She tells Stingo she was in Auschwitz. She says her husband and her father were killed in a German work camp. She carries these facts like stones, heavy and oddly rehearsed, as if she is telling the story in a form that still lets her survive. Stingo learns another truth that shifts his understanding of Sophie's guilt. He hears that Sophie's father was a Nazi sympathizer. When Stingo confronts Sophie, she admits it. Her father, a university professor, was compromised by the ideology of his time, and Sophie's life cannot be separated from that stain. This revelation complicates Sophie's pain beyond mere victimhood. She is not only harmed by history, she is also burdened by the ways history ran through her family. Sophie describes the time before her arrest. Following the removal of her father and husband, Sophie fell in love with Joseph, a wartime lover with ties to the resistance who was determined to fight back and survive. Joseph lives with his half-sister Wanda, a woman who wants Sophie to help the resistance, even if it risks everything. Wanda asks Sophie to translate stolen Gestapo documents. Sophie refuses because she fears what retaliation would mean for her children. That refusal becomes another private wound, a moment where fear wins over courage, and where later guilt can rewrite the memory as betrayal. The consequences arrive anyway. Joseph is murdered by the Gestapo. Sophie is arrested and sent to Auschwitz with her children, Jan and Ava, 2 children who want nothing except safety and who become the center of a horror they cannot understand. At Auschwitz, people notice Sophie's proficiency in language and office skills. She is assigned as secretary to Rudolf Hoss. This position does not rescue her. It alters the nature of her danger. It places her closer to power, which creates more opportunities for coercion and more reasons to hate herself. Meanwhile, in 1947 Brooklyn, Nathan continues to tighten his grip. He tells Sophie and Stingo that he is doing groundbreaking research at Pfizer. The claim flatters Stingo and supports Nathan's image as a genius. Then another character brings the truth. Nathan's physician brother tells Stingo that Nathan has paranoid schizophrenia and that much of what Nathan claims about his education and career is fiction. Nathan does have access to Pfizer, but he works there as a library employee, not as the scientific savior he pretends to be. This is the midpoint shift. Stingo realizes that Nathan's brilliance is mixed with delusion, and Nathan's love is mixed with illness and violence. The stakes change. It is no longer a question of whether Sophie is pleased with Nathan. It becomes a question of whether Sophie can survive him. After this revelation, the pressure escalations become sharper. Nathan's jealousy intensifies, and his behavior becomes more threatening. He reaches a point where his rage spills into physical danger. During one explosive episode, Nathan calls and fires a gun in violent fury. The sound and the act make the threat unmistakable. Nathan is not only emotionally destructive, he is capable of lethal chaos. Sophie and Stingo flee to a hotel. In this escape, Stingo finally acts on the fantasy that has been growing inside him, that he can take Sophie away, build a future, and redeem her pain through love. He plans a life. He offers marriage. He offers a clean start. He offers the American dream as a form of salvation. Sophie agrees to be with Stingo, but she refuses marriage. She says she is an unfit mother. That line is not only self-hatred, it is a clue to what the film has been approaching from the beginning. Sophie believes something about herself is irredeemable, and she will not let Stingo build a life on a lie. What changes here is that the story stops being about a young man watching other people's drama and becomes about a direct attempt to pull Sophie out of the gravity of trauma and illness. Act 3. Climax and Resolution. In the hotel, Sophie finally reveals to Stingo the core secret behind her shame, while he tries to hold on to a future that still feels possible. She explains what happened when she arrived at Auschwitz with her children. A Nazi officer compelled her to select one of her children for the gas chamber. If she refused to choose, both children would be killed. In that moment, the title becomes literal. Sophie is not asked to decide between good and bad. She is forced to participate in evil to reduce it, and the price of survival is a lifelong moral injury. Desperate and terrified, Sophie chooses to save Jan so that the family name might continue through him. The choice saves nothing that can feel like salvation. It only reshapes the damage into a form she can never escape. This confession answers the story's deeper question about why Sophie cannot simply leave and begin again. Sophie's relationship with Nathan has been dysfunctional and violent, but it has also served a function. It has provided noise loud enough to drown out memory. Nathan's intensity gives Sophie a temporary oblivion. Without it, she has to face what she did and what was done to her. After Sophie tells Stingo the truth, Sophie and Stingo have sex. The scene is not a triumphant romantic payoff. It is complicated, a moment of tenderness, relief, and the human need to feel alive, mixed with the knowledge that no act can rewrite the past. While Stingo sleeps, Sophie leaves a note and returns to Nathan. The return is not framed as logic. It feels like compulsion, dependence, and the gravity of a bond built out of trauma and instability. Sophie is drawn back to the person who can both hurt her and numb her. The next day, Stingo goes back to the building. He finds Sophie and Nathan dead. They have committed suicide together by taking cyanide. The discovery collapses Stingo's fantasy of rescue into a reality of irreversible loss. The relationship he tried to interrupt ends on its terms as a final act of escape that he cannot control. In the aftermath, Stingo finds a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson, a writer Sophie loved. He recites ample "Make This Bed," turning to language in the face of the unspeakable. It is the final movement of the film's structure, story as grief ritual, art as the only container left when life breaks. Stingo leaves Brooklyn. He moves to a small farm in Southern Virginia, inherited by his father, and returns to his original aim, writing. But now, the writing is different. He is no longer chasing romance and glamour. He is trying to make meaning out of what he witnessed. Analysis and themes. Theme 1, coercion and moral injury. Claim the film argues that some choices are engineered to destroy the chooser, even when survival is possible. Evidence. Sophie is forced to select which child will die, and the demand is structured so that refusal becomes another kind of participation in death. Years later, Sophie repeats patterns of coercion in her relationship with Nathan, where peace depends on appeasement. So what? Moral injury is not guilt that can be reasoned away. It is the feeling that the self has been permanently altered by being forced to act against core values. The film makes clear why survivors may seek chaos, addiction, or destructive love, not because they like pain, but because numbness can feel safer than conscience. Theme 2. Trauma as a second life. Claim. Trauma does not end when danger ends. It becomes a parallel existence that runs under ordinary days. Evidence. The Brooklyn scenes are full of ordinary life. Parties, walks, flirtation. Yet Sophie carries a concealed history that keeps reasserting itself in fragments and confessions. The story moves between the present and the camp, showing that time does not heal when memory remains unintegrated. Therefore, people often perceive trauma as a past event. The film portrays trauma as an ongoing condition of perception, indicating that the world is never fully safe, because the mind continues to exist in a state where safety was unattainable. Theme 3. Love as refuge and weapon. Claim love can become a form of anesthesia, and anesthesia can become addiction. Evidence: Sophie and Nathan's relationship swings between exhilaration and terror, and those swings create a chemical rhythm: fear, relief, affection, panic, and apology. Stingo offers a different kind of love, steadier, idealistic, but his love also carries a demand: become someone who can be saved. What this means is that the film highlights the potential for relationships to replicate trauma patterns. People may cling to volatile partners not because they are irrational, but because volatility mirrors the internal chaos they already carry, making it feel familiar and perversely controllable. Theme 4. Identity under surveillance. Claim when power watches you, identity becomes performance, and performance becomes survival. Evidence: Sophie's placement near Nazi authority because of her skills creates a survival strategy that looks, from the outside, like collaboration. In Brooklyn, Sophie utilizes her brilliance and sensuality to maintain relationships and distance herself from her past. Nathan performs genius to conceal illness and keep control. What this means is that the film illustrates how performance can serve as both a protective shield and a destructive force. When the self is built around what others need, obedience, charm, brilliance, it becomes difficult to locate an inner truth that does not depend on approval or fear. Theme 5. Testimony and the limits of language. Claim: telling the truth is necessary, but truth cannot fully translate pain. Evidence: Sophie's confession arrives late, and even then, it is delivered in a way that suggests the story has been told before in her mind, as if repetition is the only way to hold it. Stingo's final turn toward poetry shows language trying to stand in for what cannot be repaired. What this means is that modern culture frequently encourages disclosure as a remedy. The film complicates that. Speaking can help, but it can also reopen wounds. The deeper need is not only to speak, but also to be heard without being judged, simplified, or turned into a symbol. Theme 6. Mental illness inside intimacy. Claim: untreated severe mental illness can turn intimacy into a closed system of fear and dependency. Evidence: Nathan's paranoid schizophrenia fuels jealousy, delusions, and violent episodes, and Sophie becomes both caretaker and target. His moments of tenderness do not erase the danger. They intensify the bond by creating hope between storms. What's more, the film defies the tendency to portray Nathan as a mere antagonist. It shows how illness can distort love into control, and how partners can be trapped between compassion and self-preservation, especially when the relationship has become the only structure holding life together. Character arcs. Protagonist: Stingo begins as a romantic idealist who believes empathy and love can fix what is broken. By the end, Stingo becomes a witness who understands that rescue fantasies can be another form of selfishness. The moments that force the shift are Nathan's violent volatility, the revelation of Nathan's illness, and Sophie's confession that proves some suffering cannot be redeemed through romance. Sophie's arc is not a clean transformation. Sophie begins as vibrant and flirtatious, using charm to keep despair at a distance. As the film progresses, Sophie moves toward disclosure, but disclosure does not free her. Her tragic end suggests that insight alone is not enough when shame and dependency have been fused into identity. Structure. The film's power comes from narrative layering. The Brooklyn story is a lure. It invites the viewer into warmth, humor, and attraction before revealing the deeper wound that explains every early attention. The flashbacks do not function as background. They function as the engine of meaning. The dual narration effect, Stingo remembering, Sophie confessing, turns the plot into a study of how stories are carried. We are not watching events as they happen. We are watching how they are recalled, translated, and survived. What most summaries miss. Most summaries reduce the film to the infamous choice. But the movie's real subject is the afterlife of that moment. The choice is not only an event. It becomes a template that shapes everything Sophie accepts later: coercion, punishment, and love that feels like a bargain. Another overlooked element is Stingo's role as an audience surrogate who wants the right kind of tragedy. He wants to believe suffering can be purified into meaning. The film quietly dismantles that desire. It suggests that the clean moral lesson is often a luxury of people who did not live through the machinery that produced the suffering. Relevance today. The film's relevance is not about repeating the Holocaust as a metaphor. It is about recognizing patterns of coercion, misinformation, and psychological captivity that still appear in modern life. First, the story mirrors how misinformation can become identity. Nathan's confident claims and charismatic certainty feel familiar in an era where social media rewards performance over proof and where personality can outvote reality. Second, it captures how trauma can shape relationships at work and at home. People who have learned to survive unpredictability may gravitate toward volatile environments because calm can feel unreal. Third, it speaks to public conversations about mental health and accountability. The film asks a hard question. How do you hold compassion for illness without excusing harm? That tension shows up in families, workplaces, and institutions every day. Fourth, it parallels modern power dynamics where the powerless are forced to choose among harms. In bureaucracies, immigration systems, and crisis zones, people are sometimes offered options that are not truly available, and then blamed for the outcome. Fifth, it reflects the cost of being turned into a symbol. Sophie's suffering is sometimes treated by others as a narrative object, something that must mean something. When the truth is uglier, it simply hurts, and it does not resolve. Sixth, it resonates with how people seek chemical relief from psychological pain. The film's depiction of intoxication, mania, and emotional dependency maps onto modern cycles of self-medication and avoidance. Seventh, it offers a warning about the seduction of savior fantasies. Stingo's desire to rescue Sophie is sincere, but it also centers his need to be the one who makes meaning, which is a modern problem in relationships and even in online activism. Ending explained. The ending resolves the external question of whether Sophie will leave Nathan and build a future with Stingo, but it refuses the comforting fantasy that truth leads automatically to freedom. Sophie returns to Nathan after confessing because the confession does not remove shame, and Stingo's love does not dissolve dependency. The ending means the past can become so fused to identity that escaping it feels like erasing the self. The suicide is not presented as romantic destiny. It is presented as collapse, two damaged people choosing oblivion over continued psychic pain. Stingo's final movement toward poetry and departure suggests the film's quiet argument. When life cannot be saved, the witness still has obligations. The story is not a cure. It is a record, and a warning, and a form of mourning. Why it endures. This film endures because it refuses easy moral categories. It does not treat trauma as a backstory that explains bad behavior and then ends. It treats trauma as a force that can distort love, perception, and choice long after the war is over. It is for viewers who can sit with ambiguity, who want character psychology that is not tidy, and who can handle a story that aims for emotional truth rather than comfort. It may not be for viewers who want a fast plot, a clean heroic arc, or an ending that feels reassuring. In the end, the film leaves you with a question that is harder than the title. What do you owe someone you cannot save? And what do you owe the truth after the people who lived it are gone? For deeper insight and less noise, subscribe and explore the full range at taylortailored.so.uk.